Hello, I'm Tony DeMaria, the editor of JACC, and I'm sitting here with David Cass from Johns Hopkins University. And David has written a very provocative article in a forthcoming issue of JACC involving dyssynchrony and its importance and, in fact, its ubiquity. David, why don't you tell us your very provocative stance?
Well, so, this starts back when CRT, when cardiac resynchronization was first getting going, and we used the QRS duration as the marker for cardiac dyssynchrony. And the studies were showing that about 25% of heart failure patients had a wide QRS. And in fact, people were even worried before the therapy got developed that there'd be enough heart failure patients. This might be too selective. Then things changed, and we learned that mechanical motion and mechanical dyssynchrony looked to be important, and we ended up with these new techniques to measure it. And what we're seeing in the literature over the last, I'd say, year and a half, is that more and more techniques are coming on board. They're not always concordant with each other, but importantly, the number of heart failure patients that seem to have dyssynchrony now keeps rising. So we're now up, to my last guess, we're somewhere around 70% of all those wide QRS patients will have mechanical dyssynchrony, and a lot of other heart failure patients have mechanical dyssynchrony.
Sure. So, as I recall, there's been reports of dyssynchrony with narrow QRS. There's been reports of dyssynchrony in diastole, not related to systole, and in fact, there's reports of dyssynchrony provoked by exercise.
Right, and what this starts to bring to mind is something we learned probably 20 years ago in some physiology studies, when we didn't call it dyssynchrony, we called it wall motion abnormalities or timing abnormalities. But you can bring this on a heart with just blood pressure increase. You can bring this on a heart clearly from ischemic insult that might be a little bit more on one side than another. So the measurements start showing us that there are wall motion abnormalities of timing in lots of heart failure patients. But is this the same substrate that we're thinking of when we're going to use a pacemaker to actually resynchronize the ventricle? Becomes far less clear. There's a subset, that's right, but there's a big group I think it's not.
Well, but as I listen to you, you're pointing out that there's so much dyssynchrony out there, maybe it's meaningless. On the other hand, almost every study that's looked at mechanical dyssynchrony has shown that it has an adverse prognostic influence.
Right. So there's no question that if you have this behavior one way or another, it is a worse thing to have if you have heart failure than not having it. What has been less clear is whether or not let's go back to the narrow QRS, where people were seeing just purely diastolic dyssynchrony, which means that the walls suddenly start to become out of phase after the aortic valve closes. There's really no evidence that dyssynchrony can be treated, certainly not by CRT. It's very difficult to imagine how you could resynchronize diastole with something that stimulates in systole without altering systole first, right?
Sure.
So these things are going to be coupled. And there, the data that resynchronizing is actually terribly predictive. While overall, yes, but individual patients, it's awfully scattered.
Sure. So if we accept that dyssynchrony is a bad thing to have, you just do not have it, but it may not predict response to resynchronization. I guess the last question, David, is, given the wealth of experimental data, much of which you've contributed to the literature, is the inability of mechanical dyssynchrony to be predictive of benefit due to its inaccuracy as an approach, or due to technical inabilities to accurately measure it?
Both. I think clearly we're now, as we're seeing more studies appear, we're having to rethink where we are. And we might have thought we were there. I don't think we are. I think that the techniques we have still remain too operator dependent. The signals are often a bit too noisy to really interpret. It may be able to be done in the best centers and the best single, sort of a lab that's dedicated to this. But in general practice, it's clearly proven to be problematic. So we need better ways of doing this that are more robust.
Sure. So wrapping it up then, it's clear that the mechanical dyssynchrony with more techniques is being seen much more commonly. It is an adverse prognostic marker, but probably not necessarily a therapeutic marker of benefit. But nevertheless, based on the experimental data, hopefully we'll get a better way to measure it in the future, and it will be useful.
I would agree.
Thanks a million.
Sure.